Great. Great. So the motion for this round is this House believes that the Attorney General should be an elected position in a general election as opposed to appointed by the executive branch. I would like to call upon the Prime Minister. You're here.
Everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, several things in the speech. Firstly, a model. Secondly, a principle. And thirdly, why you get less politicization, both optically and in practice. Firstly, with regards to a model, 3 pieces of setup. Firstly, we think these elections will happen every 4 years. They are likely going to be staggered to avoid politicization, but also not to conflict with general elections, like the election where you elect senators and representatives. We think the reason for this is that otherwise there's no meaningful difference. Note that when many Americans go to the ballot box, they don't vote one person Democrat, one person Republican, et cetera, because the United States is so polarized, they tend to vote Democrats all the way down. As a consequence, in the event that the Attorney General elections coincide with general elections, I think they are likely to be subject to the same amount of polarization. They're likely to be voted along party lines. Secondly, though, I think that you probably need some basic qualifications in order to be chosen or run as a candidate. This is for 2 reasons. Firstly, you are just more likely to resonate with voters when you have a track record of basic competence. But secondly, you are more likely to attract donors and attract grassroots funding that you otherwise would not get. Thus, we think that even if a few unqualified candidates enter the race, it is more likely that candidates that enter the race likely have some amount of basic competence. Thirdly, we think there are likely to be restrictions on campaign finances occur in the status quo. I'll take a POI from opening opposition.
These elections are staggered every 4 years. Is that to say they occur in like 2022, 2026, etc., or is it like odd numbered years?
Yeah, we think it's probably the odd number of years. We think otherwise you don't get a meaningful difference, and otherwise the elections are likely to coincide with general elections, which tend to be very polarized. Why do you get a large amount of coercive power being more representatively driven on our side of the House? We would note that the Attorney General has an insane amount of coercive power in the status quo. Note that in the status quo, they're able to enforce the law for the federal government. They are able to represent the government in legal matters before the Supreme Court. They are able to provide consultancy to the president and influence the way that the executive branch enforces laws in the status quo. I think this is a massive amount of power that no person should have and just be appointed by or just be able to enter into without a vote. I think that no one votes for these individuals in the status quo because parties tend to be fairly insufficient proxies for voters. I think firstly, this is because often no one is running based on I will appoint this person as the Attorney General. Often people are simply voted. Presidents are voted in and then they appoint their cabinet, and you assume the cabinet is likely to be Democratic appointees or Republican appointees depending on who wins. Secondly, we think that in a 2-party system like the United States, there are just very limited representative proxies for individuals' preferences, i.e. a far left Democrat is probably dissatisfied with a center left Attorney General that is appointed by a center-left Democratic government. As a consequence, we think on our side of the House, we are more representative of voters' preferences at the point where the Attorney General is removed from the broader set of political appointees and is someone who is entirely independent. Why is this independence good for getting less politicization? 2 broad headlines under this. Firstly, why is it less optically politicized? I think the status quo in America is genuinely regrettable. We have instances where Merrick Garland and Jack Smith pursue an indictment against Donald Trump for inciting violence and inciting a literal coup in the United States of America, and yet half of the country believes that this is a witch hunt and believes that this is just political retribution because both of these individuals are Democratic appointees. I think when you have an election, it is optically less likely to be as politicized for 2 reasons. Firstly, I think that candidates for Attorney General are likely to not politicize themselves or not identify themselves on the political spectrum. This is because they don't want to alienate half of the voter base, and they know they are more likely to get voted in at the point where they run on a platform of being fair and being able to hold the government accountable. I think that they're likely to do this given that the median voter tends to be fairly centrist, but I don't think most people in America probably want someone who is deeply, deeply polarized just because this tends to lean into having tit-for-tat politics. I think as a consequence, you're unlikely to explicitly link yourself to parties. But secondly, even if you do have a track record of leaning vaguely to the right or vaguely to the left, I think you are unlikely to necessarily link this to a party. I think America is polarized to the point where you can say I'm left wing, but not have it be tied directly to the Democrats because there are so many broad political identities that fit under that spectrum. I think as a consequence, there's less of a political link between parties and between attorney generals elected. Why is this a good thing? Firstly, I think this just increases the amount of legitimacy that the attorney general has. Note that often cases that the attorney general decides to prosecute, i.e. the indictment, are often things that ought to be seen as being substantially less politicized than they are in the status quo. This is because the vast majority of cases that the Attorney General brings are very political and aim to move towards democratic consensus. I think it is especially important in these cases that you have a substantial amount of buy-in and avoid accusations of a case being a witch hunt or a case being politically motivated, insofar as these are often about things like fraud or things about like attempting to defraud the United States or attempting to commit acts of treason. I think it is substantially more important that these appear to be depoliticized and don't appear to be politically motivated. Secondly, though, I think that on our side of the house, you just got a huge amount of partisan tit for tat cases. E.g., it is very, very clear that the next time the Republicans get back into power, it is likely that they are going to pursue cases against everyone in the Democratic administration in the status quo because they want to gain some amount of retribution for Donald Trump being indicted. I'll take a POI from closing opposition briefly.
Yeah, so under the next Biden administration, there's very likely to be a legal challenge to gay marriage at the Supreme Court. If the Attorney General is a Republican and his job is to represent the government's position, is he simply going to stand up and not argue?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, this is probably unlikely. I think this is likely to be something that you can like devolve to someone else within the administration. You can probably like delegate this elsewhere. I'm not entirely sure why it necessarily has to be the Attorney General. I think the Attorney General probably has plenty of things to do. Right. Why do you get less politicization in practice? Look, I think in the status quo, the Attorney General has a very, very substantive incentive in order to align himself or herself with the government in order to avoid the following. Firstly, they don't want to be fired. Note that this is possible given the amount of cabinet firings that occurred under the Trump administration. Secondly, you don't want to be seen as a traitor by the party. You don't want to lose any and all credibility. So even if you're not fired, you still probably lack credibility and no one trusts you. Thirdly, you want to get reappointed. You want to get your job back in the event that the administration gets back into power. As a consequence, even subconsciously, I think all of these factors are likely to cloud your judgment because the security of your job is literally reliant on them. Why is it important that you are less politicized in practice? Firstly, we think this means you're better able to be an independent arbiter of the government. When the government does something bad, or when the government engages in attempts of treason or coup or obstructing the peaceful handover of power, I think this means you are more likely to pursue a just case against them. Secondly, though, we think that there is more fairness in this system. We think this means that you're more likely to hold the government to account. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the leader of the opposition. Here.
Okay, POIs in chat, please. And I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. One response to OG's case, because everything else will be integrated. I just want to note that most of their case hinges on the premise that this will be a depoliticized role once there is an election. I just think intuitively this is not very good strategically, but let's delve into the structural analysis. Note that they claim the median voter is centrist and isn't polarized, and therefore attorney generals will also want to tap into the centrism. This is factually incorrect. Most Republicans support Donald Trump. His popularity also increases whenever he gets another criminal charge. They believe the election was stolen because this is a narrative that he is going through, and only like 2 Republicans were politicians themselves were able to go against this, and now their careers are ruined. Conversely, most Democrats think that most Republicans are absolutely fucking crazy, possibly justified. The point is that you have an incentive to tap into these voter bases, because insofar as you're campaigning, insofar as you're trying to get the public vote, it's very easy for you to, for example, pick, let's say, a specific law that the current administration is trying to push through and show why that is something that will appeal or will enrage, let's say, a certain part of the voter base to be able to get that, right? Look at the and that OG has been very unclear as to the type of election that this will be, which oftentimes means that you don't need to always capture a majority of the electorate to be able to be the front runner, because you can just be the majority, like the relative majority within multiple candidates, who can then eventually get, to the other rounds of voting, or however else do you want to make this. So you have a very big incentive to be able to tap into the voter base of like one specific party. And it's, I would say, usually likely to be the party that is not currently in charge of the executive branch. Why is this the case? The case is, the reason for that is because the first 2 years of the presidency of an executive branch, which is, around the time during which like this will happen, is usually married with a lot of unpopularity because they're unable to pass most of the stuff that they promised, because it takes a lot of time, because very often there were different like backstops set up by the previous administration that don't enable them to do this that well. So very often people are dissatisfied with the current administration 2 years into them being in power, which gives you the ability to be able to then usually campaign against them, right? I think that this is problematic because this can lead to other issues, such as, for example, gridlock, or such as the entire process then being politicized because people watch the extent to which the attorney general that they have voted for is able to mitigate a lot of the stuff that they criticize the current administration for, right? Even if you don't buy this to such an extent, the core notion, the polarization within US politics still stands, and the fact that this will be depoliticized is extremely unlikely. First argument then on why this increases gridlock. Note that the executive is voted in by the people, right? And so they kind of express their democratic preference there. And they need to be able to make their government such that they can deliver on the promises that they have made to the people who have given them their vote, right? I want to firstly note that people are likely to vote badly when it comes to attorney generals. I would say the first reason for that, and this is important because this is different from a politician's job, because a lot of a politician's job isn't necessarily about specialized knowledge, because they themselves very often have a bunch of advisors and whatnot, and it is mostly about representing the will of the people. Whereas comparatively here, an attorney general needs to have extreme amounts of knowledge with regards to how the entire legal system works, how to properly draft legislation, how to give advice, how to pick judges, and all that, right? I think people comparatively then, especially, so people are likely to then vote on things like biases, like how well a person sounds, how good do they look, right? To what extent the halo effect is present there, as is like natural because we use heuristics and other rules of thumb to make decisions for us, because making proper analyses is quite difficult. And that's especially painful with regards to voting for someone who needs to be in a specialized role, right? There's a reason why we don't elect central bankers in every country that has a functional economy. Why then comparatively are politicians likely to do this good? I think 3 reasons. Firstly, politicians and the executive branch themselves have experience from being in politics, so they know who to pick based off of their qualification. Secondly, they have knowledge about their own agenda and the details and about how they need to pass that agenda to actually deliver on the promises that they made to the public. And thirdly, because they have things like advisors that will enable them to pick the best one possible. I think because of this, politicians are likely to be more analytical with regards to how they pick their attorney general and de-biased, such that they pick someone who is meritocratically able to deliver on their promises. I think this already flips OG, because comparatively, I would say the attorney general election will also just be less popular than like a presidential election or anything else, right? But even if their point is about expressing people's preferences, I think the weighing here is that more people vote for a president who needs to deliver on their promises, which means that the comparative preference satisfaction is larger on our side, insofar as we enable presidents to actually deliver on their promises when they are able to select the best attorney general to be enable them to do that. Before I continue, Steve.
If politicization is symmetrical, like you say, and we elect on party lines, is it not better for democratic elections where people take responsibility regardless of good election or bad election outcome?
The point is that polarization is like a very deliberate thing. And there are many things that you don't need to politicize as a party, insofar as you know that it's not in the public eye, right? So in that way, the politicization with regards to picking the attorney general in the status quo isn't really there, because this is something that is not in the public eye, therefore something that the public doesn't think about that much. and therefore isn't politicized and polarized, right? So I reject the premise. Let's then take a look at the impact of this, right? Because not only will you not satisfy the preferences of the public, I think it will lead to a gridlock, because the party that is now in power is less able to deliver on their promises, because the person who was supposed to advise them on legislation, fought for it in the Supreme Court and make the proper changes within the justice system, isn't fully on their side or isn't as competent, right? This looks like a lower ability to be able to timely respond to crises, a lot of wasting of political capital, trying to argue and overcome the challenges posed by this either incapable or non-aligned person, which also means that you cannot focus issues on cannot focus your attention on issues that actually matter. How to approach.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Just give me 1 second to organize my notes. Also, if you have a POI during my speech, I would prefer if you offered it non-verbally in the chat. I'm going to do a few things in this speech. Firstly, take down the case from the previous speaker. Secondly, explain how this will be the best mechanism to resolve the current crisis of legitimacy and democratic backsliding in the US political system. Thirdly, on actual corruption. And finally, a brief note on the principle. Let's deal with the previous speaker. Firstly, on the claim that you need to have knowledge. Number one, this is unresponsive to the setup Daniela gives you that the most likely implementation of this election is going to be the basic requirement that candidates have credentials. The reason why this is likely is that given that the US bureaucracy is the one designing these rules, they probably don't want to have an idiot attorney general who is entirely incompetent that's going to exist. In certain European countries where you have elections for positions like school minister, someone who manages the water at the municipal level, this is a common precedent that we only allow people to run for these positions who are basically qualified. Secondly, in the event that you have people who are less qualified, they will get things like special advisors while running the position. Given that they still care about their reputation, they often might want a feature position in politics and they don't want to do a bad job, they'll have an incentive to consult people before speaking at the Supreme Court, and they can probably outsource a higher number of their mundane tasks. Thirdly, we reject that a lot of what the Attorney General does requires specialized knowledge, which fuels our principle about why this is a democratically subjective decision that citizens should have a right to. Choices of if we impeach or not, which individuals we're going after for prosecutions, which is the most politically important role they have because it impacts US democracy the most, are actually very subjective because laws around these areas tend to be highly ambiguous. Therefore, we think that people's choice are more important than the kind of objective facts that they are processing. Fourthly, we reject their claim that politicians always appoint the most specialized people. What do you think the Trump administration is going to care about more if they are reelected? Loyalty to Trump, aka going after Democrats and tit-for-tat retaliation, or the most qualified person on the books. Given the very qualified Supreme Court candidates that Trump rejected, I would posit that they probably will care more about loyalty and won't be an expert anyways. Next, we heard them claim both in a COPOI and an OO of, oh, what if the Attorney General has kind of a different political agenda to the politicians in power? Firstly, this is the point, guys. We want them to have a different political agenda. We want to stop the conflict of interest that's happening under the status quo, and we think that a checks and balance is good. But I do think that a baseline degree of cooperation is going to occur, and they're not going to be actively obstinate, because this would be bad for the reputation of both parties. If, as the Attorney General, you are seen as someone who was like unable to do anything in government because you are incompetent or you are vetoing everything that the party is presenting, you're definitely not going to get reelected. And this could be a way to alienate voters, given that you'll probably run on a platform of getting something done And if the party's refusing to cooperate with you, they're also going to look very ineffectual, which could lead to degrees of political backlash. Finally, just on how this election is going to be run, I think the runoff election model is very plausible. A lot of European countries have this. Even if the field that we're voting for is quite crowded at first, a very plausible way that this could be run is two candidates do the best in the first round. There's then a second election, meaning that the person who gets elected will probably need a relatively high degree of popular support. What matters most in this debate? U.S. democracy is currently suffering from a crisis of legitimacy and democratic backsliding. There are grave risks to the democratic process, and this is more important than anything that Teioh is going to tell you. Why are the grave risks so high? We literally had January riots where people stormed the Capitol building after Trump said that the election result was a lie. There's mistrust that's being peddled in mainstream media. Parties absolutely hate each other because of political echo chambers. We need to move toward broad democratic consensus that is going to exist, and the Attorney General is very important in facilitating this process of moving toward a democratic consensus to protect democracy. They might need to deal with questions like impeaching entire presidents who in government, because given that prosecutions from the January riots are still ongoing, which kind of people are going to be prosecuted? This is not, however, just a legal issue. This is an issue with the hearts and minds of Americans. It's not enough to just go after the people who are leading to democratic backsliding, because if you go after the people and it's perceived as being highly politicized in nature, that's only going to create more wounds and cause even deeper degrees of politicization that are going to exist. We need to go after those who are fueling democratic backsliding, but only in such a way where there is legitimacy behind those actions. Given that, I've now proven the frame of why buy-in to the Attorney General is the most important, why in fact is politicization not symmetric and substantially better under our side of the House. We gave you multiple mechanisms. They only respond to the first one, that voters don't exist alongside the median. This misunderstands American democracy. Voters are very polarized along party lines, but voters are not polarized inherently. If you actually poll Republicans, a lot of them are willing to support very early trimester abortions. But because of how radicalized the Democrats and Republicans are against each other, it removes the capacity to get political consensus. Given that we characterize it, that you're probably not going to run as a candidate with direct affiliation to a particular political party, you are able to appeal to the median individual because you are not trapped in the typical election degrees of party polarization. We also gave you other mechanisms here as well. The fact that affiliating with a party is a terrible political strategy here because you're automatically going to alienate half of the political spectrum that's going to exist. As a consequence of this, it is not just enough to say America is already polarized. Polarization can get so much worse. It was polarized 10 years ago, but it's way worse now. It's literally willing to hire people on the opposite side of the political spectrum. Are you going to protest every single time that you think that an election result is unfavorable? Polarization is decreased, and this is the most important thing. I'll take a PY from Teioh before I continue.
So if we take OG best case and we assume, I can't hear anything. Okay, if we assume that we do OG policy and they don't run on the policy line, then they kind of have to announce, like, I'm going to prosecute specific person in their campaign so that voters know literally anything about them. Doesn't that mean that on balance, we probably have more lockups of, say, past political leaders?
So we're fine with running on platforms of who we're going to prosecute. Do you know why? Because I think that voters have the right to choose which people they deeply trust to run or they're going to prosecute. But I also think it's fine to run on general ideology that's not explicitly partisan. Like, I'm going to prosecute a lot of people. I'm going to prosecute fewer people, blah, blah, blah. On actual corruption, in the current Hunter Biden case that's occurring, Hunter Biden got way lower charges than people normally get for the possession of a firearm. The reason for this is probably that even though the special counsel looking into him is nominally independent, this is still overseen by an attorney general with links to Biden. The issue of having direct political affiliation that Daniela characterizes is that they always want to suck up to the party in power because they don't want to be fired. This is bad because not only is it simply unfair that the child of the president gets off too easily, it's also very dangerous that if we're not going into people who are corrupting government, who are corrupting democracy, that might actually be leading to significant international harms, we need to yeet them out rather than having risk of political biases. On the principle that got no response, this is different from the chair of the Fed because it is about the right to control the terms of your government in the first place. Are we going to impeach the president? What are the rules of the game? These are subjective decisions that deal with the most important questions of state coercion. Could not be prouder to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the deputy leader of the opposition. Here.
Hello, I assume I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. I'd prefer points of information for people to just interrupt me, or I'll call on you. I won't look at the chat, so that is how things are. I'll start the speech in 3, 2, 1. There's 3 important things I want to go through in this speech. The first is on why these elections will probably be highly political. The second is on why specialization is very important. Finally, tackling this idea on representation, maybe some extraneous responses if I get to them at the end. Let's talk about this politicization. No, important framing. This is the one election happening in a certain year. American media is highly politicized, especially on TV, radio, and the internet, which is how most people consume media in the current year. The fact this is the only election to focus on means it will be just as politicized as any other election, and there will be lots of broadcast media highly focusing on it. Secondarily, every election Americans are already familiar with has been politicized anyway in this century. Unclear as to why this will be any different. But finally, and importantly, even with a high amount of polarized media coverage, this doesn't inform people. 2 reasons. Number 1 is that most of the unbiased political knowledge that Americans have about, say, the president or the Senate comes from their education systems, schooling, and just general public information, not media. But second, highly polarized media is incentivized to not inform you of processes, just to get you to vote for your tribe and spread as much misinformation as possible. Libel laws are very loose in America, so they probably spread a lot of lies about the other side. The second, so I think, is a highly politicized election. At the very least, it's symmetric. Let's talk about specialization then. I think OG are able to prove that the people that voters can select from aren't idiots, that they're minimally competent, right? I think we concede this, but I don't think this is a high enough threshold to meet. Why is this? 1, the Attorney General has to go through several hour-long grill sessions from the Supreme Court. They have to be maximally competent. This is why it's important for the president selects for, even among a group of competent people, they select for the most competent one, because they will be versus 9 of the other most competent lawyers in the country. This is the difference between a somewhat competent versus a very competent person. A somewhat competent person would get annihilated by this level of scrutiny. A very competent person can withstand it. Secondly, competency isn't the only thing here. It's alignment and the specific ways in which they're competent. A president can only accomplish so many things in 4 years, so they have a specific agenda. So the people that they select need to have high-level knowledge and these specific policy pushes they want, so those areas can withstand legal scrutiny. Voters won't be as aware of these specific policy pushes that a president will know about, because the president is the person who is making those policy pushes, and they can analyze the CV much more granularly than the public can of these people. Public are likely, as Alex tells you, to just default to the sexiest campaign. The impact here is that if you want somebody who's able to bat for the president when the president is making a push like desegregation in the 60s, if you don't want them to be annihilated by a Supreme Court, then you have to pick somebody who's familiar with the type of legal rights representation and human rights representation that can get this past them, that can withstand these sessions. There's other mitigations that are offered, but I don't think they're sufficient. The first is that they can get special advisors. Look, you can't access your advisors in the number of impromptu and responsive work that the Attorney General has to do. If you use them as a crutch, you're likely to be exposed. And given your likely exposition, your legitimacy is probably massively undermined, and you're unable to do your job as seriously when people don't take you seriously. So you're just unable to do your job to maximum effectiveness. And the final response was that Trump was very nepotistic. Look, for one, I just don't buy that every president was the same as Trump. I think we can agree he was a complete aberration. Let's be good faith here. But second, I'm not clear that Trump always completely valued loyalty. If you observe the amount of turnover he had in his administration, it appeared that a number of the decisions were being made by people behind the scenes who were selecting competent people, and then Trump would just a bit of a hothead who fired them, but then the people behind the scenes would just select another competent person. So I really don't think this is a strong enough example in order to take away the structural analysis that presidents probably have better access and understanding of the legal competency of these people, especially because a lot of presidents like Obama have backgrounds in law. Let's talk about representation then. A couple of claims that I think are just kind of silly before I just go on to the rest. There's a claim that far-left Democrats might be dissatisfied when the center-left president appoints the center-left Attorney General. I'm just not clear why most voters in the US are far-left, why they would vote for somebody with those predilections, and why this person would be effective. But the other problem I'm unclear about is exactly why representation matters over competence. In OG's world, you'll have countless other roles which are appointed, like Supreme Court justices, military leaders, and chair of the Fed, right? The exclusivity which they provide is the principle where they say you need to control your president because your president like controls the governmental system. But look, controlling the governmental system is important and it is hung on the ability to control your life. But the thing is, the Fed also controls your life because they control monetary policy, which is going to impact your pension, which is going to impact your wage. So since all of this reduces down to controlling your life, I think this is sort of like a false principle and it just reduces down to impacts anyway. So I don't think it really matters much in this debate. I think importantly, though, these are highly specialized roles. And this is one of the important criteria for when a position should be appointed. The first one is specialization, is that voters lack the knowledge and understanding of what's important and highly technical within this position. The more proportional system to go for is one in which your average president, even when they operate at their worst, is probably just lazily defaulting to the strongest CV, which is at least better than just defaulting to the sexiest campaign. But the second proportional thing about selecting this type of person, I'll take CG.
Yeah, within the House of Representatives and Senate, it also represents some level of legal fraternity and some level of legal knowledge, yet we allow the public to vote on that. Why are you okay?
This exactly now. The second criteria why you might want to have a democratic election is if there's a level of locality. If there's 100 senators, it's feasible to hold them to account, especially if you live in a smaller state like Vermont. If there's 500 representatives, it's plausible to leverage them via petitions and process. If there's thousands of local councillors, you can literally talk to them. There's one exception for this, and that's one exception, which is their president, which has a multi-year, extremely rigorous process to select. And at the very least, all countries need to have a head of state, so they just default to a necessary evil. I don't see why you should expand this. The other things that DPM mentioned, I just don't think are likely to be changed by this type of thing in a major way. Like the primary repeat material I'm responding to here is like the legitimacy crisis of democracy. I think this is a grand macro thing which is happening over many different countries in the world, which is operating in many different political parties. I just don't think that one election to elect one person, even if that person has a fairly important role within the state, is likely to reverse, change, or impact grand macro narratives and trends of a crisis of legitimacy and democracy and backsliding. I just don't think that's a tipping point. I just don't think they should be credited higher than having the most competent Attorney General total.
For that fine speech, and now I would like to call upon the member for the government. Here.
Can I be seen and heard?
You can be seen and heard.
All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I just want to start this by saying that a vast majority of the opening half debate is contingent on a very shallow perspective of what the polarization of politics looks like. So surely when there's a choice between Republican and Democrat, you will be forced to pick between one, and that is where the polarization occurs. But the contention from closing government is that when those politics disappear, when you're no longer choosing between parties, but between 15 equally competent decisions, and that is where we get the most equitable decisions and the most merit-based systems. Before I talk about extensions, I think I want to get out of the way really quickly the rebuttal from DLO that senators are localized and therefore you can vote for them, but you can't vote for the Attorney General because it's a whole country thing. That's ridiculous, right? Because you have a local Wisconsin Supreme Court, which the local people vote on, and then you have the federal Supreme Court because there are different levels of bureaucracy. There's the local Attorney General of New York, and then there's the federal Attorney General. So presumably you're still voting for the president. It is a single vote. People don't need to write in like a 15-page submission of why they would vote Joe Biden. So clearly it's also just one vote. Presumably then the bureaucracy will be symmetric. What this means is that there's nothing unique about the Attorney General. And if we prove that there are certain instances where it would be better under closing government, then opening opposition really has no case when it comes to why is the Attorney General so special then. Two issues then, but I'm going to talk about the implementation of elections firstly, and how this is going to realistically politically manifest with regards to these elections. First, how will the average American civilian vote? And why will it be uniquely depoliticized beyond the mechanism of opening government of just saying, just because it is going to be a staggered system, therefore it is going to be depoliticized? We are going to talk about the characterization of polarization. And we think that this characterization in the opening debate is a harm that is only present in general elections. And here's where we go far further than opening government by just saying, oh, we have the bare minimum that's going to exist because regulations or something. We think that when opening opposition talks about voting along party lines, all of that only exists when there are two candidates in the general election elections because there are two irreconcilable differences between parties. So for instance, the staunch feminist is never going to vote Republican. The transphobe is never going to vote Democratic, even if they are, like, for instance, anti the Capitol Hill riots, they will still have to vote Republican then. What's the difference then? We think if there's the disillusionment with regard to the two-party system in the status quo, it is very likely that the most competent candidate to rise out of this messy political fight is the candidate that says, I'm not from any party, I'm going to hold everybody accountable, and I'm going to be the most objective meritocratic person that there is. I'm going to hold everybody accountable. I'm not political. What is the impact of this, and how does this actually look like? People are going to vote competently because people care about the competence of the people in power. So when you vote, for instance, for the president, you're voting for who most looks like you, who can most represent you. When you're voting for the attorney general, everybody knows that this is an academic position, which means they're probably voting for somebody who is competent. Parallels of this would be, for instance, the greatest criticism towards AOC or to any fresh Republican candidate is that they have no experience in politics. They cannot govern, they cannot go into Senate. The greatest criticism of all of them is they're incompetent. The Supreme Court justices that are put forward, all of these candidates are scrutinized on the basis of their experience and their competence, which means that society is actually a great arbiter for this competency, and they're more likely to go this way because they've already politicized their government, right? Like, I've already put Joe Biden or whatever in power. What I care now is that I have somebody to hold them all accountable, and I have somebody competent in power, which means I'm likely going to put somebody competent in power. What happens differently on opposition is that nobody is ever going to vote in a president because the attorney general or whoever is on his platform. They vote on a basket of other issues. There are 30,000 other things: climate change, the economy, healthcare. They're never going to care about the competence of these specific attorney generals, which means there is more room on opposition for them to be exploited for political purposes and for the perception of it than for this to be a corrupted system. On our side, we think because of the dissatisfaction with the two-party system, we're more likely to have a better system of accountability. Why then is this depoliticization uniquely important? For two reasons. One, because this proves it is going to be a good or at least healthy election. And this proves what opening government merely asserts, that it is going to be healthy just because we stagger it, just because we have a schedule, just because there are regulations. But what does the healthy election mean secondly? These are the exclusive impacts then of information about the job of the attorney general. If it's true that everybody is so stupid, then what we change under closing government is that when you have to say, look, I'm the best position for attorney general because look at my credentials, look at my CV or whatever not, this response then to deputy leader of opposition about information, media campaigns, things like that. The average voter will be able to decide which is the most competent individual based off the information they're being given, which otherwise they would never get on opposition. Here's the comparative. There's no information whatsoever on opposition. They just have to trust that Joe Biden makes the right decision. And even if Biden makes the wrong decision, no one can say anything because they can't care and they are not voting them into power. We have some imperfect information sometimes, but the point of democracy is that it's going to be an aggregation of the best decision over time. Eventually, we'll have a better system, a more meritocratic system. You have to start somewhere. Before I go on, I'll take opening.
You say presidential elections are politicized because two candidates face off. However, your opening government said that this will be a runoff election, therefore also having two candidates likely party aligned.
I think it doesn't really matter whether or not it's a runoff election. The point is that the Supreme Court justices are now the attorney generals. Don't put themselves forward saying, I'm Democratic, I'm Republican. The difference is that on your side, when you're voting, you have to pick the party lines because that's the only way you can vote. On our side, it can be a runoff, but it can be two different people who don't swear on any party and even insist that they will hold both parties to account. The difference is that they're allowed to escape the party lines because they don't have to be tied towards the administration. So Merrick Garland can never say screw Joe Biden because he's part of the administration. But when there's an independent election, there's more accountability and a greater degree of depoliticization then. So the media campaigns are a good thing. Why does this then better the role of the attorney general in three ways? One, I think this better responds to the closing opposition POI then, is that a vast majority of the American population does in fact support gay marriage. So if the attorney general was voted in based on Democratic popularity, then they wouldn't allow the kind of radical Republican to push the anti-gay marriage agenda. And secondly, if it was true, and here's where we're being more charitable than opening government, where they are contingent on the attorney general and the administration in power having different views. If they're the same views, great, then it's even better because people believe that they put that into power by themselves. So they need to have the illusion of them choosing the attorney general. Otherwise, everything is going to be politicized. But we think that if there is such a great disparity between what the attorney general wants, which is democratically elected, and what the administration wants, then presumably the electoral college has failed and the attorney general is the more democratic option, in which case we would support that kind of accountability mechanism over nothing at all. OG's case then is contingent on the senators, for instance, being an insufficient proxy for representation. Again, this is just a critique of representative democracy, not for the Attorney General specifically. How then does closing government's extension uniquely fit into this? We think uniquely the Attorney General needs to be specialty representative, because opening opposition's case then needs to prove that there's an analytically correct option. Insofar as that doesn't exist, and it is only merely about the subjective interpretations of the law, whether or not protecting the rights of individuals also refers to their sexuality and their gender orientations and things like that, all of that is contingent upon a subjective interpretation that can only occur when you allow the democratic elections to occur.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the member for the opposition. Here.
All right. Assuming everyone can hear me, if you have a POI, please put it in the chat and I'll take it not out loud. Cool. Opening government says that voters largely have good incentives and non-polarized incentives to pick AGs. The first part of my extension is going to prove why this is not true. Then, closing government says that the government has bad incentives to pick AGs who are held accountable and that voters will do a better job. Again, my extension is going to clash and take down all of this. Finally, opening opposition talks a lot about the capacity of the government to rule. And a lot of this is based on the idea that there's going to be opposites. So just because someone is the incumbent, voters are likely going to vote for the other party just because they do unpopular things in the first 2 years of their election. We think this isn't a realistic or correct scenario of the world. The first part of my extension is going to explain rather why Republicans have an enormous advantage in the AG race and why this is largely a bad thing and is going to have negative implications. The second part of my speech, and we're going to be the first team in the round to do this, is to explain why the status quo is good and why there are good positive incentives to pick neutral AGs. On to the first part of my speech then, about why voters are likely to pick bad representatives. The first reason is the idea of money. And this is the entire reason that Gov's idea that people are not going to be Democrats or Republicans fall out of the race. It is prohibitively expensive to run a federal campaign that gets attention across the entire nation. It's not fair for OG to say that campaign financing laws will exist because there's obviously the People versus Citizens United, and super PACs are legal and will continue to be legal in America on either side. What that means is that there are huge financial interests in this election. Firstly, on the sides of parties, Democrats and Republicans obviously have the most sophisticated funding machine. So even if some candidates don't align with Democrats or Republicans, the candidates that are backed by those parties are obviously going to have the most money, the most success, and the most visibility. Remember, as my partner POI, you obviously are able to access an enormous base of Democrats or Republicans by just pledging for either party. Again, it makes no sense on down the bench on proposition how people are not going to align. What does this mean? We think that the person that likely is going to win the AG is going to be someone who is aligned with business interests, because businesses who might be prosecuted or affected by things like more stringent regulation against companies or prosecution against companies for different claims are obviously going to have a huge horse in this race. And we think that Republicans, again, the party that tends to be on the side of deregulation, that tends to be on the side of higher taxation, are probably also going to have deeper pockets on the issue. So the first thing that we want to flag is that there's obviously a huge financial incentive to fund as businesses to fund the campaign of the AG who is going to be most friendly to your interests. We think that this overwhelmingly leans to the right wing. But the second thing that I want to say is just about campaign dynamics and why it is likely that Republicans are going to work this. The first thing that I want to say is that Republicans are far more united. They tend to be united on the same issues, and they tend to be okay with voting for one candidate, even if that candidate isn't their thing. The problem with Democrats is that they're fractured. There's likely going to be multiple Democratic candidates, as we see in the primary, and whichever candidate loses and doesn't make it to the runoff election is probably going to lose a massive amount of the Democrat base. This is the first structural problem with the Democratic Party. The second is just age and interest. We see that Republicans overwhelmingly have richer, older voters who are actually more likely to vote in these side elections, vote for elections that are in the midterms that aren't the ones that are secondary elections. Even if Democrats might be able to rally their base enough to vote for the presidential election and the midterms and the House and the senators, for the average young person that probably doesn't vote anyway, in the majority of instances, they're the base of the Democrat Party, they're unlikely to turn up for Attorney General. The obvious response to this is, well, people feel like there's going to be a death to democracy. But the problem is, obviously, during the 2020 election, there was already a threat to democracy that Trump had established, and voter turnout rates were still pretty low. The problem here is that it's often not tangential to people's lives, that for people that don't vote, these centrists and moderates that prop want to hang their case on, unless they can directly say, this is going to affect my ability to feed my family and offer a prosperous future for my family, it's very, very difficult to convince and sway those people. The Republicans have the opposite idea within their platform. Their main idea and platform is that they're being criminalized, that they're being unnecessarily attacked, that they need to unite their base to protect them, and that there is a kind of zeal over the idea that they are being criminalized. The other side is illegal, they are legal, and that they need to prosecute them. We think that there's a unique incentive and unique messaging with the Republican Party that is able to drive voters, wherein they are able to say that we need to do this, or our candidate, our Trump, who we have created a cult-like persona about, is not going to be able to get into office. We think that for all of these reasons, for the business interests, but also the demographic and also the messaging interests of the party, we are far more likely to get a right-wing thing. Why is this bad? We see the slow erosion of American democracy. Maybe not a direct overturning of an election, but looking away when states break gerrymandering laws, looking away when states violate the rights of minorities and violate human rights and freedom of speech. We think that this is ultimately going to be extremely negative to allow the polarization that exists in American politics to seep into the Attorney General's office. On to the second part of my speech then, about why you have good incentives to elect good Attorney Generals. Before I move on, I'll take CG.
So presumably if the elections are going to be politicized on both sides of the House, then you're going to get the exact same outcomes on either side. Why is it not better for individuals to have a say in it and have voting?
Perfect. Two reasons then on why it's better on our side and why parties who are elected have good incentives to elect good AGs. The first is that both sides just obviously want to avoid extreme political prosecution. Even though Trump was obviously very biased and broke a lot of norms, Mike Pence, for example, still refused to overturn the results of elections. Bill Barr, who was the Attorney General under Trump, resigned after the January 6th crisis because he was not willing to put up with it. He was not willing to put up with the extremist actions of Trump. Even if you look at other departments, for example, things like Powell being nominated as the chair of bank, who was a moderate that Biden also later asked back to the position, shows that governments have a predisposition towards the center. There are three reasons for this. The first is that they actually care about the Attorney General being able to win cases. Obviously, the Attorney General represents the government and the government's interests. They want to hire someone who likely has a long history in the law and has shown a competence in actually winning cases when brought to the bench. And that's probably going to be someone who is more moderate, someone who is able to have a long history and proven themselves to be a competent lawyer in a variety of ranges. But the second thing is that both sides have a strong incentive to not be tied up in pointless legislation. The AG's office, which every political party has an agenda for the AG's office to accomplish. If that AG's office is tied up the entire term just fighting pointless charges and trying to prosecute the other side where no such charges exist, that's obviously going to be extremely detrimental for their party and for their party's interests. We think that what that means is that both sides have an incentive to be moderates to a degree, to pick people that are going to be relatively likable, relatively agreed upon on each side. The last thing that we want to note, though, is that there's a considerably strong law lobby, that there are huge PACs like the Federalist Society that have huge sway in Washington and want people who are respected within the legal field to be selected. That means that because the legal societies across America have huge sway both in funding, getting donations, legal votes, but also their social impact and how they're able to influence their peers, we are more likely to see someone elected who has lots of experience, who is well respected in their field, and as such is probably not an extreme fascist. These were the first team to prove incentives, very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the government whip. You're here.
Hi, can I check that I'm audible and visible?
Yes, you're audible and visible.
Great. I'll take POIs in the chat, so just leave them there. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think the problem with all of the houses in this debate is that they were far too outcome-based in an election cycle that is uncertain and truly no one can predict. That is to say, opening government's case is hinged on them electing an attorney general that is opposed to the ruling government, which is uncertain as to whether or not that is always going to be the case if it is truly polarized, like opening opposition and closing opposition point out. But also, are there potential instances where the person that we end up electing is the same person that we would have ended up electing under the executive branch? All of these are plausible questions that could exist, maybe not all the time, but are still questions that exist in this debate. On opening opposition and closing opposition, the presumption is that we are still going to abide by party lines, and therefore that is the end all be all, and insofar as things are symmetric, it is therefore better to default to an executive party that knows the actual externalities and knows the specific information that's required for the Attorney General role. Closing government was unique in terms of explaining actually and extending why the democratic mandate was important in terms of and why it does not regard what kind of outcome arises from the from this election cycle. But second, we were the only team to explain to you why there's a fundamental difference in the polarization that exists within a general election system and an election for the Attorney General. I'll largely deal with this within the issues, but I'll deal with closing opposition first. They have two large things. One, in terms of how this system would favor Republicans overwhelmingly, and second, they are explained to you why the current mechanisms within status quo is sufficient. On the first thing, on why Republicans have an enormous advantage, the large bulk of this analysis was tied to money. In terms of the resources asymmetry that exists, which likely means that on a federal level, these are individuals that are likely going to edge out. A few responses here from closing. Number one, note that the current political climate is one where receiving large financial donations has become politically disadvantageous. Note that Elizabeth Warren was a Democratic primary frontrunner previously because she did not accept any corporate sponsorships. Hillary Clinton literally lost the election cycle because it was revealed that she received massive and millions of dollars in contracts from banks. Note that there are different incentives as well for lobbyists to even want to invest money on a federal level, given that the general election is far more important in terms of how it oversees literally every department and all policy making that the nation has in totality in comparison to an attorney general, where we agree is an important role, but albeit obviously less important than the president and the ruling party that sits. So number one, in terms of who are the individuals funneling money on scale, we don't think it's the same, and they can't just co-opt the same level of analysis that applies on general elections. But secondly, we think there's a trend to move away from accepting large donations, especially when individuals are likely going to be enfranchised within a world where lobbyists take over and kill their lives and prevent and create policy deadlock and create policy that does not actually account for the people, but often are just policies that feed onto cronyism and the individuals that funnel money into the system. I think that largely takes them out of this round in terms of that contention. Second, the status quo being good. Note that this is a non-argumentation. No one competed as to whether or not this person was competent or not. Obviously, there are incentives for a competent attorney general, given you're not always going to just be fighting someone from the other party. You actually need them to create policy advisories, etc., etc. The question that closing opposition had to answer within this debate is when push come to shove, when you had to bail out your employer, in instances where you had to indict them, in instances where you had to represent them, were you going to be objective, were you going to be neutral, or were you going to toe along the party line system, because these are the people that put you in place and these are the people that can necessarily take you out later. That is uniquely what they don't respond to. So them arguing that there's competency in status quo is not an argument. No one actually contended on that. How does closing government then weigh out against all the other houses? I think we provide two unique things. I think we provide, number one, in terms of information, and secondly, in terms of explaining why there's a push to the middle and centrism. One, in terms of if the role of the Attorney General is extremely broad in status quo, you force information to exist only when elections are created. The best policy decision and the best kinds of outcomes exist when there is information. And the information only has an incentive to exist insofar as people need this information to make particular decisions. In the status quo, individuals on average don't know what the Attorney General does. The role is all-encompassing in terms of what are the policies that they can necessarily enact. If they're going to be advising on, for example, the Department of Justice in terms of how the federal policy ought to enact the war on drugs, etc., these likely impact individuals on a day-to-day, but people are unnuanced and don't know about these kinds of things. Only through an election cycle do you force information streams to necessarily exist. Even in the worst case, we explained why some information is comparatively better than none. But in a world where there's only disinformation from two completely diametrically opposed lines, then the kinds of information that individuals then pivot towards likely is information in the middle. Information that will stand the political backlash from both the Democrats and both the Republicans. Information that is neutral is the only information, therefore, that people can necessarily rely on. Therefore, in terms of information, I think that's preemptively taking out OO and CO in terms of the decision-making calculus. But let's then therefore deal with polarization. It's how we mechanize further from OG. Before that, API from OO, if there's one. Closing.
Right,
sorry. Opening.
Go, Alex.
Right, so why then? So you say that more information is good if there is an election. Should then people, for example, elect the president of the CDC or of the Fed?
I think there just needs to be a line that is drawn somewhere. I think that given the Attorney General has large significance in the lives of individuals, that necessitates the ability for individuals to have some level of democratic say. Here's where we extend from why the democratic principle is important, and because I don't think there's a lot of impacting, aside from just saying it impacts me from OG and therefore I ought to have a say in it. The reason why, and this links to their own democratic backsliding principle that isn't actually linked to that at all, is because people are only satisfied with the outcome insofar as they have a say in it. So when DPM and when opening government correctly characterizes how individuals are dissatisfied with how the Attorney General operates, only through a democratic election where people are participatory do people consent to therefore all of the harms and repercussions that happen as a result of the election cycle. That is only existent where individuals have a say in it. But what do we then necessarily provide in the extension that is unresponded to note from closing opposition? Recently, politicization is different from general elections. Given on a general election, it is an all or nothing basis. That is to say, regardless of whether or not I agree with most of the conservative policies, I can never agree with what the democratic policy necessarily says, and vice versa, which is why a lot of conservatives, like DPM rightly points out, don't agree with a lot of the policies actually by the party, but are opposed to what all the Democrats are necessarily going to have. Given that it's either elect that or have the opposing party control all systems and all facets of society. It is fundamentally different when it's the Attorney General. We've already secured who the ruling party is. The Attorney General is therefore a check and balance mechanism towards an individual as opposed to someone that's able to forward their own political propaganda, which is why it's going to be detached from the same level of polarization, and that is why individuals would then move to the middle and be far more meritocratic. On our side, the judges are appointed. On our side, individuals make decisions with information, side with closing government.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the opposition whip. You're here.
Can everyone hear?
Okay, can me hear?
Cool. Let's re-enter the real world. Why did the most right-wing, borderline fascist president in United States history, and Donald Trump, select us as Attorney General Bill Barr, who by all accounts was a moderate? Why? Well, because the Federalist Society wanted him to. Because in the United States, the way in which conservative lawyers mobilize is unrivaled anywhere else in the world. They have political networks, they have funding networks, they have friends who scratch each other's backs in terms of political favors. And that is the most relevant and important reason why when you free up an election that's likely to have low turnout and low information, and where the majority of voters won't genuinely care about what outcomes happen, the groups that are able to most effectively mobilize are going to dominate these elections, leading to not just Republicans winning, but right-wing extremists who will look the other way as a Republican president like Trump or someone like him dismantles democratic norms. The first thing I want to talk about is the context on Trump. Then I'm going to talk about closing government's criticisms, and then I'm going to weigh over both opening teams. The first thing I'll note is that opening government really is quite wrong about what happened with Bill Barr, because what they wanted the Attorney General to do on January 6th was to mobilize, to do something. What did Bill Barr do on January 6th? He resigned. The most right-wing Attorney General in American history, because he was inculcated into a legal culture where he was respected by his legal peers, conservatives, constitutionalists, people who opposed abortion, all kinds of other Republican views, could not stand the idea of him remaining in power. And that's because the way in which lawyers as a constituency operate is significantly different from the way that right-wing extremist voters behave and what they want their lawyers to do. And that's why Bill Barr felt that he had to resign to protect his professional integrity. But second, why did Donald Trump appoint him? It wasn't just for no reason. It's because he had already won. Presidents don't announce who they're going to make their attorney general. They wait until they win. And once they've won, they don't have to placate their extremist base by appointing someone who's a crazy radical, even if that person isn't super competent or would upset their legal lobby like the Federalist Society, or if they wouldn't be very cooperative. They can afford to appoint someone who's more likely to be pleasing to both sides. That's why Merrick Garland was appointed by Biden, despite being a borderline Republican. That's why Jerome Powell, if you think about the Fed, has been under both the Trump and Biden presidencies. Before I go on, I'll take Naomi.
Aside from the fact that there's a lot of rich left-wing people and left-wing crowdfunding, saying that there's some lobbying just mitigates our case. Being secretly Republican or Democrat is better than being appointed by Trump or Biden, who are two of the most hated people, depending on where you stand on the political spectrum.
Yeah, of course. It's just that they're likely to be in power at the moment when the presidents need and deserve a mandate. Like the whole logic of the Gov principle is essentially that presidents deserve a mandate, but they don't really, because it would probably be a good thing if a Democratic president like Biden comes into power, but can't pass anything because next year, in response to the fact that people are always mad at incumbents, a Republican comes in and blocks them from having any agenda. I think that destroys faith in politics. But secondarily, like opening gov is right. It is true that presidents, on balance, are going to pick someone who they trust and support to be their attorney general. The point is that who that person is and what their underlying values are likely to be are fairly moderate and fairly affected by the fact that they're like a judge or a legal person who believes in upholding the law. And if you don't appoint someone like this, the Federalist Society gets mad at you, because the Federalist Society is the largest organization of conservative lawyers in the US, and they also oppose January 6th. They oppose the most dangerous forms of backsliding. And I think the reason why this affects OG so significantly is that so much of their case is built on stuff that's just not true. For example, the Attorney General has no role in impeachment. In the most serious cases of Democratic backsliding that they're talking about, Attorney General does nothing. In the case of Bill Barr, he resigned because he felt morally that he couldn't be in the administration. It wasn't because he couldn't do his work. In terms of Hunter Biden and the idea that the Attorney General under the Democrats have done corrupt things, like, first of all, Hunter Biden isn't being directly prosecuted by the federal level. It's by a federal circuit, but not by the Attorney General. But secondarily, all this claim seems to relate to is the perception of corruption. I think that ultimately is symmetric because it just depends on which party is in power. Obviously, I think that there's a major risk that emerges. No thanks, I'm not taking another. A major risk that emerges of retroactive prosecutions. And that's where our case comes in, which is right now, in terms of politics, it affects Trump or it affects Biden at the polls in the next election, in a high turnout election of relatively normal voters, if they appoint an attorney general who wants to lock up their political opponents. But if the attorney general is not officially affiliated with Trump, but is still a right-wing person who wants to let Trump do what he wants, Trump can wash his hands of it. It's the attorney general. It's not his ally. Trump is not politically accountable for doing the bad things that his attorney general is. But you can be damn sure that extremist right-wing billionaires like Peter Thiel are going to fund the guy who's going to let Trump do whatever he wants, because that's where the money ends up coming in American politics. So the end point of this is that in the status quo, political candidates, no matter how extreme they are, have to appoint an attorney general that is trusted by both sides. So they don't become a political liability. But now they can have someone who, though is not officially an ally of them, is in practice an ally of them, get elected from money from the same donors and from the same support base, and be able to say, well, this is the law. This isn't my politics. In fact, I think it is a good thing that voters in the status quo are suspicious of attorney generals who are appointed by Biden or by Trump, because that is a chilling factor that makes it more difficult for them to do stuff that is abjectly illegal. It's why Bill Barr had to resign. It's why Merrick Garland isn't going after every single Republican that committed campaign finance violations. No thanks, closing gun. So how do we fit into the round? We make two very important contributions. First, opening op only claims capacity. They say it is true that politicians are better at determining who should be the attorney general, I don't know, based on their LSAT scores. But that is not what we care about. Everyone who's likely to get to be attorney general, as Gov agrees in their policy, is probably baseline competent. What matters is their values. What matters is when it comes down to it, will they prioritize the law or will they prioritize naked partisan loyalty? And we've seen, even in the most extreme possible cases, that because of the political forces that act on people like Trump, in terms of who they have to appoint as their attorney general, both in terms of what lawyers think and what the general public thinks, they have to appoint someone who will not crazily help them. But the floodgates are open once it's a general election. Under a general election, there is not the same turnout as in the presidential election. There's low turnout. Young people don't turn out. People who really care about legal issues do. And what riles them up? I'm going to jail Hunter Biden. I'm going to jail Hillary Clinton. Lock her up chance. Those are the things that mobilize, because normal people don't think about the attorney general, even if that shifts a bit under Gov. What matters most to the people who say the most radical stuff, who can get to the runoff, and then there's no choice but to choose between two relative extremists. On closing Gov, they're primarily derivative of opening government because their new addition on democratic principles to say that legitimacy is what matters, which opening Gov already mechanizes out. I think that there are two endpoints to our case. Number one, that there is a vastly higher likelihood that unfairly one party has certain advantages. Opening government has a model that says we can have basic campaign finance. That's true. They can have all the campaign finance laws that the United States has now. They don't get to invent new laws that would be presently illegal in the Supreme Court. So what ends up happening is that you have an election that's low turnout, high money, and where there's no form of political accountability for anyone to have to say, this isn't my attorney general. That's what enables someone who is in practice a Trump ally, in practice an extremist, to win without Trump having to bear the consequences or face any backlash. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech, and thank you all